I'm Christoph von Tomme, and welcome to the API Resilience Podcast. If you've ever wondered what it really is we do when we do APIs, and if you've wondered how APIs change organizations, our communities, and our society, look no further. This is the podcast you've been searching for.
I'm really excited to have this conversation finally.
Yeah, we've been going round and round for a while. You're a busy guy, I'm busy, so it's good to be here.
We first met in person, I think, in New York.
Correct.
Was that the first time? Yeah.
That was the first time in person, yeah.
But we were already connected before, but then that's where we really started talking. And then we had this amazing conversation that I came back with like lots of new ideas. Yeah. I'd love to redo that conversation to some redoing is never possible, but have a 1.5 year later recap. Yeah. Like, how did it all work out? You actually gave me the idea for the solution portal. I've mentioned this a couple of times on the podcast, but I would love to deep dive into that a bit, like where that the idea came from, and then how our conversation sparked that story. And then also, like, before we dive into that, maybe if you could give a short introduction of what you're doing in your day-to-day job and how you're involved with APIs and what your perspective is on this whole landscape. And then maybe also what makes your landscape so special.
Yeah, I can do. So I'm Michaela Halliwell. I'm a product manager at a company called HCSS. They are the leader in heavy civil construction and utilities software. So we serve thousands of contractors across the US and beyond. And our suite of products covers everything from estimating to operations to project management, telematics, safety, equipment management, and reporting. And when we talk about heavy civil, we're talking about the horizontal construction, not vertical construction. So we don't do sky rises or apartment buildings or houses. This is pipelines, bridges, roads, highways, airports, things like that. Heavy equipment, heavy civil. HCSS has been in business for about 40 years now. And so they have a lot of data. And so when I was brought onto the company about 1.5 years ago, the need for my role was to product manage the APIs. And so we've got over a dozen unique products for heavy civil contractors with a lot of APIs that had just been opened up, and no one really focusing on how we listen to our customers around our data needs, how we design our APIs to be consumable, easy. And I think HCSS did a pretty fantastic job before I even came on, and maybe hadn't even given themselves enough credit for how much they had done. So my role in the last 5-6 companies that I've been at, I've been involved with API productization, developer portal creation, operations, customer interactions with enterprise customers who are designing these big integrations with their ERPs. And so that's just a little bit of my background. Every role I have gotten in my professional career is due to APIs. And so I have a really warm spot for them. My role expands beyond APIs as well. I'm also over all of our platform and reporting and data products. So Direct SQL, Power BI embedded, all of those things, our identity products also are under my purview. But APIs are really where I got my start, where I've really focused a lot of my professional discussion and passion and things that I just continue to stay interested in.
And how is the API landscape in the construction sector? Because
catching up.
I figured.
Yeah, when we look at the API industry as a whole, specifically product APIs, open banking, finance, obviously these are highly regulatory industries are very involved. Compliance industries, when you talk about security, cybersecurity, these are all highly regulated industries. Construction, not so much. Same with medical, not even so much. And you might think it would be that way, but a lot of them are catching up to where really the standard is. And I think HCSS has done a brilliant job of really leading and paving the way for heavy civil contractors and construction and utilities to just kind of get where everybody else is in terms of exposing APIs, building connectors and integrations, leading the discussion around usability of APIs, catching up. But there's a phrase that I use a lot of times is that sometimes I'll still run into 5 guys with a truck instead of these big enterprise companies that are worth billions and that trade on the stock market, and all of those companies are not the ones I'm talking about. I'm talking about your smaller enterprise companies, your larger SMB companies that want access to data, that want the same advantages with their accounting softwares, with their ERPs, their CRMs, their HR softwares to get data in and out of HCSS software. to be able to track their revenue better, to pay people on time, to understand where they're losing money, where their equipment is, any questions that can be answered in this sector. And they're catching up. And I think we've caught up quite a lot in the last couple of years in terms of making these exposed APIs consumable, building integrations, building solutions that are repeatable. Yeah, I'm impressed by the hunger and the appetite that's there. HCSS has a yearly, and it started back almost 40 years ago when the founder of the company invited 6 customers to his dining room table and just said, what are the problems that matter to you? And these round table type discussions with customers became bigger and bigger, and every year. And now we've got over 2,000 customers that come down to Houston every year, and we throw over 800 classes, and it's just 3 days it's the construction Super Bowl. And that was why we rescheduled last month, is because that's where I was. But the first time that I taught classes there was last year, and we sold out our API class to everybody's surprise. And this year we ran 8 different classes, each standing room only, which shows you the appetite and the hunger that this industry has, and they're ready to implement the solutions. They're making the changes. They're being bombastic and demanding about making things the right way and being API first. And it's a transformative thing to see.
That's amazing. That's really amazing.
It's incredible. It's incredible to see. It's incredible to be a part of. I've never been at a company where customers are this passionate about the products that HCSS customers are. At a lot of companies, you might have a company party, and then that's where the small talk starts and everything. Not HCSS customers. They'll talk to you until midnight about the products. And it blows my mind at how passionate they are about, because these products make a difference in their safety. They make a difference in their day-to-day. And seeing them want to dig in deeper, it just makes all the work truly worth it.
I was already hinting at it a little bit, but like we had this conversation a year and a half ago. And if I remember it, even though it was said we were not going into the utility versus product thing, but actually I think it was actually triggered by that question of APIs as utilities versus APIs as products. I think that was
it 100% was. I had read what you had said about that online, and then I went to your class, which it went over like a fart in church on LinkedIn by all the keyboard folks. But honestly, like, I wanted to talk to you about that because from a product manager experience, I come into that with my fists raised almost and be like, they are 2 products, because that justifies my job. That justifies a lot of the reason that we talk about APIs as products. But I think we both came to the same conclusion, is that whether you call them products, whether you call them utilities, the way that you design, the way that you make them consumable, the way that you give these APIs to your customers determines what they are. If they're running in the background and hard to manage or hard to consume or hard to put integrations together and there's no documentation, then no, that's not a product. It becomes a product when you apply a product management approach and productize it.
So, and I think that the main difference between API's utility and API's product is that API's utility is even more productized, because it's gone so far in productization that the whole world has agreed, or at least a big part of the world has agreed, that this is how we're going to do this API. And we don't need to make our own design. We can just, this is the way we do this.
You start with the customer problem. I'm going to use HCSS as an example and their customers. I need to get time card data synced with my ERP. And I need those 2 to be on the same page so that when I pay, it's accurate. That's a customer problem. If we design the API to have those fields that the customers care about, and the rate limits are also designed, so not just the API, but the infrastructure around it is also designed to solve the customer problem, then that's your product. And then you face it forward. And whether you charge for that product or you don't nickel and dime your customers for data, that's really just business philosophy. But that solution that you're giving them is what creates the product that you can turn and sell, or create more loyal customers that are now even more deeply embedded into your product suite.
Yeah. And I think since we talked, the whole AI hype tsunami that we're still in the aftermath of, I think that hit. And I think that made that story about API as a product that is like something really built only for your organization, or an API standard, or the standard not necessarily, but like a system that is cutting across like the whole industry, and that makes it so that you don't have to do a one-on-one integration with an API as an API consumer. That I think is also accelerating because of APIs. Because of AI. And so that's where I mentioned that in the pre-call a little bit, that I'm really excited about Model Context Protocol from Anthropic, because I think that potentially could be, you don't need to do an integration with a specific API. You can just make an MCP connection, and then anything that is available on that server becomes available to you, so that you can start doing queries with an LLM and have the tools available that are on the other side, or the data that's available. There's some questions about how do you do access control and how do you make this safe and whatever, but it's really exciting to see that since we had that conversation, I think this has happened. And I think that is a very good candidate for that API utility that I was talking about. Because at that moment, the thing I've learned since that conversation is that even in a world where there's a utility, like electricity is a utility for electric power, but even though that we have electricity everywhere, and like we have got power sockets everywhere, we still have batteries, we still have generators, we still have all these tools that are doing the same thing as generating this utility. It's just we have products for it next to the utility. So it doesn't mean that products will go away. They'll still, like, there's a good chance that there will actually be more need for products in that same world than there was before. It's just that both will live next to each other, and that not every API should have to be a product. Some of them, it's enough if there's as utility.
Yeah, I got to keep some stuff to yourself too. But in terms of this idea that AI could potentially replace SaaS products or aggregate data across products, I think that's completely doable. Whether it's providing insights or executing tasks without users needing to do things manually, APIs and AI together could create a big opportunity. I see it as an opportunity. Some people might see it as a threat. I think you got to evolve, right? It's an opportunity. AI is, in my opinion, not going to completely one-to-one replace things, but it will continue to push software. And whether that's by integrating and doing automation with the offerings, helping make decisions without navigating multiple tools, and so becoming more connected. But the industry has got to be ready for that, right? I think, at least in construction industry, it tends to lag behind tech adoption. So a full AI adoption or driven shift may take a little longer. But I think that, at least with our customers, they so rely on this structured workflow that AI automating a lot of things that are currently manual could be a real competitive differentiator. You're talking about how you build products. I think they could play very nicely into each other. Yeah.
I think also like having structured workflows makes it easier, because then a recent interview I did with Ronald Ashery, who's one of the co-founders of an AI Open Dialogue, it's called. It's an AI tool for designing a conversational AI. And he said something really interesting, that in the past with natural language processing, you had to help the models. And he said, now you have to hold them back. Like you don't want
big time. Big time. Yeah, that has been a shift that I've seen. Even when we talked in New York, I was running this idea past you, like, hey, I want to put a co-pilot over my API documentation because I want to make this documentation more consumable. And we did that. It's out there, developer.hcssapps.com. But that co-pilot, it ended up going from, feeding the API spec, feeding the how-to docs, feeding support cases that are scrubbed of customer data, but resolutions to support cases and questions that we get, feeding it to it and training it on how to respond, to then having to pull it back and say, don't make anything up. It sounds very intelligent when it hallucinates. And so that could potentially be something to be wary of with these type of AI assisted API documentation, right?
Yeah.
So the first draft might not always be right. Generating code samples that may not really exist, or hallucinating endpoints that aren't really there. But it does have its uses for onboarding. I've seen, like, how do I get started? Where do I find this? Yada, yada, yada. But really having to put the guardrails on it now that it's trained, and having to say, stay within these lanes, that seems to be more of the challenge with the LLM tools that I've seen and the ones that we're building. Yeah.
So we started off with this API products versus API utilities. And then we started talking about what I've started referring to as solution portals, which is, and
Right.
I think this was sparked because you're in this interesting position that your organization has both implemented APIs, API products, but you also have a marketplace. And then customers will come and have, I've got this problem, how do I solve it? And so
not only marketplaces, but we have Workato embedded iframes as well, where we've got accounting integrations that true up data from one system to another and all of that. So we have teams dedicated to building these custom integrations with Trimble and Viewpoint and Sage and all these big accounting ERPs with HCSS. And so it's multiple API products outside the developer portal and marketplace as well that are doing this. But customers come to find a solution, and what you've built or how you've designed your API can either make or break that integration.
And there was also the story about how do you guide customers to the right solution? And I think this concept of basically turning the developer portal into a use case library, that where you can have a description of the different ways that you can fulfill a certain need, be that with an API, be that with pre-made integration, third-party application, whatever. That was the...
What are you coming here to solve? What are you coming here to do? And I think it's Marty Kagan in his book that he says, don't build any products until you've talked to at least, I think he says 30 customers. Make it 100. Make it 100 customers. Don't build a thing until you talk to that many customers, because everybody's API need is going to be unique. And you can start pulling out the commonalities when you've got a decent bell curve that you're talking to. But I think that the solution that you build is in those conversations, and you can ideate on how to go about it. But until you have really good understanding, and this just goes back to product management 101, right? You have to understand the customer problem. And until you're having those conversations, you're just guessing at it.
Yeah. But it's also how do you make all of those things findable and discoverable? Because right now they live across a different bunch of landscapes. Have you made any progress? Because we talked about this.
Yes.
I know that you have a lot of other priorities, but I'm curious, did you get any further with executing on that concept of an integrated place where you can go and say, I've got this problem, tell me how you can help me solve this problem?
We are building it. And I would say it's probably, we're betaing it with a few customers right now. So the problem that I'm trying to solve really is that about 80% of the millions and hundreds of millions of calls that HCSS customers make to our API every year are made by only 35 companies, 85%. So how do and we've got some almost 4,000 customers. So how do I get 3,965 customers able to consume these solutions as well? And so that's the problem I start thinking about, and how to open this up, how to talk to or how to solve those problems. So first we talk to customers, right? We understand what the problems are. A lot of them have similar problems of truing up their accounting system data, or wanting to build reports based off of APIs in real time. They want to be able to track trends. They want to be able to understand where the time cards are, where the equipment is, all of these very real-time problems that we can solve with an API. And so with that, I brought on a couple people last year, and we started building out how-to docs. So that meant talking to customers, asking, not only do I know what your problem is, but how are you currently solving for it? And how can we design the API to better be more efficient, to make these calls faster so that we're not having to go grab an ID from here and user from here. We do it all in one call. So making this a little bit more scalable, a little bit easier to consume in terms of volume of calls. So we start with that. We built out a bunch of how-to docs. Then we start feeding it to the AI, right? And like I said, the AI still needs massaging. It needs guardrails. And that's where we're at now. And then the idea is the next step would be that a customer could come to a solution portal, and marketplace maybe is no longer a separate entity, and developer portal is no longer a separate entity.
Yes.
And Workato is no longer a separate entity, but we have integrations.hcss apps. And you can come there and I think you've mentioned it before, the AI is the UI. And what problem can I help you with? And a customer asks, and it can build custom docs and custom use cases or videos right there from that integration app. And then it can lead you to going and designing your integration with your middleware, with Boomi or with Power Automate or whatever our customers use, but being able to have these more custom solutions for each customer use case and really being able to broaden and lower the complexity of working with APIs so that it's really just a match the data fields. That's the vision I see. I don't know. My developers are probably going to roll their eyes when I say something like that. But the idea for me is just to be able to open this up for more customers.
I think the necessary evolution that developer portals need to go through is that the problem is that then they're no longer developer portals because they're becoming something else. Because
it's a completely new product. It's a new solution. Yeah.
Yes, because there's still the developer audience that you still have to create great developer experience for. But also there's basically the majority of the people, of your customers that don't have developers, they suddenly also become an audience.
Oh, yeah, they're more of a conceptual user. A developer is a procedural user. They're going through the case by case. They're giving you feedback on the docs, right? From the documentation saying, hey, this step didn't work, or I ran this, and where do I fetch this, and yada, yada. That's very practical. But when you have people like CTOs, CMOs, smaller startup companies who are saying, I need to get my name out there. I'd like to be on this marketplace. We're going to build an integration for our one customer or whatever it is. And you have those type of folks coming and saying, how can I work with your API? What can I get done? And they don't have the developer background. You have to be able to design solutions for those folks as well. And honestly, that's normally like the majority of the audience, I find in my experience. The developers, they can get into documentation in a reference doc and go through it pretty quickly. But the folks at least I talk about designing for consumability are the folks that don't have that background.
Yeah. You said something interesting about those organizations building applications. You said, I think that without the solution viewpoint, which is actually a product manager viewpoint, I think, to the space, you end up with a marketplace that is about the rent that you can charge from the people that are building integrations on top of your platform, rather than really about...
Yeah, it's a revenue option.
Yeah, it's a new revenue source. And that sounds really interesting for investors. Of course, everybody likes to see more revenue, sure. But I think that it's a fake dream that's been sold to companies, because I think that for most organizations, that's just not the reality. And even if they go that route, you get such a disjointed experience that it actually does not help your customers. I think that like a flat marketplace where the only interface is search, that's okay for something like Amazon or for Google Play or for the App Store, where you just have a humongous volume of solutions and you just let people duke it out. But I think that if you care, and maybe you make a wrong decision about the application, at least they're going to be safe. But that is, I think, if you really care about your customers, then I don't think that's the right experience. Or at least for most organizations, they can't afford it because there's just not enough developer volume to get enough coverage for that to be a good experience. You can't just rely on long tails. If you have a much smaller developer community working with you, you have to manage it better and create a better experience, I think.
Yeah. And I think it's different when we talk about monetizing APIs and nickel and diming customers. that want to build integrations. So you can offer API consulting services. You can offer a marketplace where you've built these connectors that are part of your product roadmap. But I think the idea that, at least in my experience, trying to get money out of the data that company already owns, there are other ways you can go about it in getting that revenue. Like you said, partners, other companies that are paying to be on your marketplace. You want to partner with companies that share the same level of dedication to customer support. So you don't end up managing this entire ecosystem of customers raising their hands and saying, I've had a bad experience with someone that you advertised. You know what I mean? I would almost tend to caution companies that just want to collect logos on a marketplace. Go for the companies that your customers trust, that you trust to be on the same page in the terms of with the quality of support that they offer, and go for quality over quantity. I think that if you try and just collect logos, you're not going to be able to scale the number of solid working integrations that are built, and you're going to run into customers having bad experiences.
Yeah. Also, I think API teams are having bad experiences.
100%. Got to protect the developers too.
So then there is this trend of developer portals. I'm going to be doing a poster session at the Information Architecture Conference in Philly 2 months from now, like in May. And I'm going to talk about the past, the present, and the future of developer portals. If you're game for that, do you want to jam a little bit on that one? Starting from portals like as external facing API portals. Like what have you seen throughout your career? What kind of portals have you been working on? How's it evolved?
I'm going to expose myself a little here. The first time that I created a developer portal, I was at a company with a team of about 35 technical writers. And their documentation was a little rough, a little choppy, and we had just developed a new design system for external facing. It was flashy, new UI, it looked a little more cleaned up. And they said, who wants to redesign the API portal? This is a project we want someone to do. And everybody's hand went down, right? Nobody wanted to touch it. And I'd probably been on the job like 3 weeks, and I was like, I'll do it. And I'm like 24 years old. I didn't know what an API was. I think I went back to my desk and Googled it right after that. And then 8 months later, out comes my first developer portal. And I was so proud of it the first time as this like young technical writer. And now I go back and look at it and I'm like, woo, that's rough. It's rough. And I took experiences and what I learned from there. But the things that I saw there is no exposed API documentation. So everything was just like manually written up or PDF generated, or the UI might have looked really good, but there was no use case docs. There was no how-to docs. There was no spec that was exposed. And then you see the rise of companies like Postman and README and Redocly and these companies that really, Pronovix as well, like that build these incredible developer portals for companies and offer a way for there to be an industry standard and a look that is congruent. And so people start getting used to seeing the same things, right? And so with that experience, my first developer portal, I took it to the next one, right? And then we had how-to guides and we had sections for different users and we had ways to call support if you have questions. And on that evolved over different companies to now we're talking about AI generated docs, and we're talking about Mercado and companies like Agave building these custom integrations that are tailored to user behavior, clear structured navigation, API first design, real life onboarding, real world examples, tutorials, cookbooks, recipes that showed business value, not just the syntax. Integrated support, so forms, feedback mechanisms, AI assisted help, code samples, all of these things. And I could do an entire podcast just on what are the elements that make up a good developer portal, or why is Stripe considered best in class when it comes to their developer portal. I could talk about that for hours. But in how far it's come in the last 10 to 15 years is really the rise of data. I always roll my eyes when I hear that data is the new oil, right? Everybody says that. I think it became the world's most traded commodity over oil, and that's where that comes from. But even when we talk about HCSS customers going from having 0 API classes at our user group meeting to now we have 8, and next year we'll probably have double that on what is an API, how do I get started with it, to more in-depth, this is how to design this specific integration, bring your developers, or the entire world is going the way of data is what I would probably say. Instead of that, there's a hunger for it. A lot of companies have been used to moving from spreadsheets to really this just connected Internet of Things world that we live in now, where everything is expected to be connected. It's almost table stakes nowadays to have APIs.
The data is the new oil. I'm still chewing on it. Like I've heard it, of course, before, but I'm wondering.
And it's going to continue to evolve too. Like this is not the end state of APIs at all.
No, not at all. And do you also have async APIs on your platform, or
Yes.
or it's really interesting how it keeps on evolving and how fast it's going, and even also outside of the capabilities of what makes a good developer experience, but also the function of a developer portal, how that is evolving, like splitting off internal developer portals and platform portals versus external versus like marketplaces that then came up. And it just feels to be relentless.
And AI is going to play a big role in that, from the auto-generating of first drafts to making human curation of those drafts consumable. Interactive elements are going to replace static docs like chatbots or guided walkthroughs or like those dynamic UI that we mentioned. Voice and multimodal documentation, API AI instructors that are providing audio video explanation over docs. But I think there's also challenges that we face along that way too, with over engineering and accounting for every possibility, and really just it's that same quality versus quantity thing, right? Instead of focusing on core use cases that impact the majority of your users, bad naming conventions, inconsistencies and parameter names, or versioning, unclear responses, you name it. Like there's still those challenges. And then feedback loops, still remaining in contact with your customers. Some of them they're going to be very proactive in staying in contact with you, right? But it's the quieter ones that maybe their usage falls off or it doesn't grow. That's what I'd be interested in. What is their real usage, instead of making an assumption? So having that feedback loop really in place. I think those challenges are going to be key in addressing. Companies that do it well are going to be the ones that stand out.
So what's the role that governance plays in all of this? Like, how do you handle governance?
You're assuming I do. I'm just kidding.
I'm assuming you do, yes.
No, I do. It was one of like my day one issues, I think, because at least when you have so many disparate products that have been developed over 40 years, a lot of them developed over different time periods in tech. Some where the mobile push versus now everything's going from desktop to web or on the cloud. So you have a lot of these products developed, not in silos, but just in different times. And so the key really, at least with HCSS, is developing governance and flexibility at the same time. What I recommend to companies experiencing something similar is to establish a golden path, the recommended flow and way to use the APIs, but that allows for power users, it allows for flexibility. So we're talking about rate limits. There is going to be different needs for different companies. Use linters, use style guides, get your core group of senior and principal developers together once a month and develop these things and automate the best practices rather than relying on humans to enforce it. Because if you do, that's not going to happen, right? So it's a catch-22. If you have too much governance, you don't have enough flexibility. If you have too much flexibility, you don't have enough governance. And so really, this is something that we're always improving on. But I think that they have to counterbalance each other.
How does that play out in your industry? Is that different? Is there anything? So you talked about like lots of different formats that are causing specific challenges, but is there something that specifically in the construction industry that's okay, this makes it harder?
I don't think it's construction industry specific. I think it's a complexity that exists with APIs. in making sure that you're not giving too much information away about your internal infrastructure and the way you design and the way you write code, but also making sure that you're compliant. Our industry doesn't have nearly as many compliance GDPR or CCPA guardrails as like open banking might, or insurance or what have you, but there's still a desire to row the boat the right way, if that makes sense, and making sure that we're designing this smart, sleek, fast, and giving the customer the information they need without creating security issues. I think that's something HCSS does really well. And it really boils down to a lot of communication between teams and making sure that we're looking ahead, far ahead when we're designing these things.
How is your executive support? Because it sounds like you've got this all nailed. Yeah.
No, I'm not joking. It really is. The team that I get to work with not only shares the mindset of customer first, but also sees the hunger in this industry for better data, for more data, for better designed APIs, for better reporting. And I feel like I was hired and told, build whatever you want that will solve this problem, and with full backing. And I have genuinely felt supported from day one.
Yeah, because I know that there's a lot of organizations that will start with an API program, and then at some point the steam runs out. And it's so API kind of moves underground. It becomes like just an IT thing, or the governance, like the regulation push is passed, and now there's other fires to extinguish. But it doesn't. That doesn't sound like your case, right? Yeah,
that happens. It doesn't mean that APIs aren't important, or maybe it does with organizations like that. I don't know, but I think that's why you have roles like mine, why you have API teams and integration teams and API product managers and people who are constantly shouting from the rooftops about this. And I think it really boils down to how much are you listening to your customers? Because if it is a problem for your customers, it should be a problem for your C-suite. That's the long and short of it. If it's not a problem for your customers, then okay, maybe you get to where the industry standard is, and you don't need to push past the innovation for that. You need to go and innovate in other ways that do matter to your customers. But I think in this industry, what we really see is, with such an appetite for better designed APIs, for the consumability to be broadened to a large customer base, I don't think that is going to be swept under the rug anytime soon.
I think that's like APIs as digital interfaces that help to change the timescale at which your organization works. There should be a priority for everybody. I don't think that there's any industry where they can't make a difference. And yet still, I think it's this making sure executives understand what APIs are about and the real impact.
Those are those conceptual users. I had to go on tour a little bit in my own company sometimes. And even with punching up and punching down with people who on all sectors of the business, like, I know we hired an API product manager. What's that about? You know what I mean? And just going on tour and saying, here's what I do. Here's how this works. Here's why it should matter to you. Here's how to talk about it. Here's what the roadmap looks like, whether that's we're going to design integrations or we're moving from monolithic APIs to more flexible API building blocks or what have you. If your culture at your company, like it is at HCSS, is to treat your customers not just like users, but actively soliciting feedback and iterating, and to implement designs around your APIs that are actually used and refining them and how your customers are using them, instead of assuming that they'll figure it out because you have two docs. That culture of removing friction and advocating for your customers, that's going to be, everyone's going to have your back in the work they're doing if you explain what the mission is, right? If you put the people to work.
How is monetization in your case? I have seen that typically it's much easier for business to understand APIs when there's at least some flow of money because of API business. How are you in
I'm not
that?
sure how much I should say about this, but yes, we do make money from APIs. We don't make them by call. We don't charge by rate limit, but we offer API consulting around our integrations. We build custom integrations for customers and charge for that. But if it's on our API developer portal, it is free to use for customers to consume.
Cool. Yeah.
We have talked many times about how else can we monetize this without nickel and diming people? How can we at least offset the costs that we take? Yeah. And a lot of that comes down to consulting, comes down to building custom connectors. And then we have our marketplace where our partners, and a lot of these partners use it as a marketing, but we require that if you're on our marketplace, you have built a live connector for a mutual customer. And so it is a problem solved for someone in order to get on the marketplace. It's not just a logo.
That's great. Yeah. And is it because one of the key things around monetization is this, like there's the expectation here again with the Twilio examples, like the API darlings, as I call them, where a monetization was fairly straightforward. It was just paper API call or something like that, or at least in the early days. I feel that coming from that perspective, thinking like, okay, an API call as an SKU that you can just sell, I think that's in a lot of cases just the wrong idea.
Because I agree with you. The charging by call, that's not necessarily solving the perceived value versus actual cost. Usage-based pricing models, I get, but if you're charging per call, I don't know. It usually is more than one call you have to call in order to solve a specific integration problem. So I would advocate more for value-added services, not just blanket access. Yeah. Keep free tiers out there, keep it frictionless, but limit advanced capabilities to paid users. If you've got companies running 60 million API calls on a weekend to true up their ERP, that's a little bit more of an outlier use case that you could potentially put some guardrails on and make that a paid user. But for just calling the API, it's their data. I don't know. I tend to shy away from a pay per call because you're only really going to get the top 1% of your users biting on that anyway.
And it's also, in some cases, it's not contextual enough. Sorry, it is not contextual enough. In some cases, you actually would want to pay people to use your API because it's bringing in you additional value. In some cases, you want to charge a lot because they're taking people out of your ecosystem. In some cases, if they're taking your data, if a competitor comes along and starts using your data to feed their own service, probably you don't want to allow that. But if you do, then you want to charge a lot.
Yeah. No, they would have to have API client secret access, and we were not going to give that to competitors. Of course, not customers or third parties that a customer has hired, perhaps. But again, we really would advise against, for security reasons, giving any information to third parties. Customers are the ones who call APIs. Yeah. Customers and
makes sense.
Commercially signed partners.
So what's the advice you would give people that are in your shoes? So you find yourself not only even owning the API program, but also part of the marketplace experience. Because that's, what would you recommend people? If your manager, for whoever's listening, their manager comes around and says, great, from tomorrow, you are our product owner for our marketplace. What would you recommend them to do? How should they take that challenge?
Ask a lot of questions, understand the problem, quality over quantity, prioritize the developer experience, design your APIs with clear business use cases in mind, and encourage an ecosystem of participation, not just marketing. You want integrated apps, not static logos. Integrate AI if you want to, don't if you don't. But treat your APIs like products or utilities that test, gather feedback, iterate continuously, offer beta access and real-world validation. Make sure that your security and your governance is standard. Test it. Hire companies to test it for you. Ensure that you have industry guidelines, all of these things. But there's a billion things that I could probably advise. It really depends on the problems you're trying to solve, but tailor the solutions. Do the best that you can to reach industry standard, especially with security. And listen to your customers.
Yeah, listen to the customer. That's always number one, the most important one.
Well, you'd be surprised. It's not number one with everybody.
Yeah.
A lot of companies say that it is. I very rarely see companies that listen to their customers like they advertise that they do.
Yeah. Is there anything you would still like to share or something you would like to pitch?
Oh, so many things. No, I do get tired of seeing API docs that is just the spec put out without any type of getting started or any type of how-to or any type of like just built with the assumption that people are going to figure it out. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I feel like that's just doing the bare minimum. It takes 30 seconds to expose your API reference on Swagger or README in a free version. That's not doing customers any good. Maybe the top 1% of the 1% of your customers, but a lot of customers are going to want more and expect more from you. So yeah, I don't know. I see a lot of things like that. And every developer portal I go to, I can probably find at least one thing that I'm like, oh, I'd change that.
Always.
You know that. Yeah, there's always something. But put some effort into it.
Yeah.
Be proud of it. Yeah.
So do you have any places where you'll be speaking? Because you're also, like, I've seen you at a couple of conferences.
I think there's a plan to speak at API Days either this year or next year. I know we were going to do some more conversations in the New York API Days with talking about not only construction, but supply chain data. And I'm not sure if it's going to be this year or next year that I'll be beating a track on that. But no, I think probably the goal right now is to dig deep into the products. And maybe later this year, maybe next year.
There's a little
API Denver I'll be speaking at.
I'm really excited to see the solution portal you're working on. And
I'm sure we can talk a year and a half, 2 years from now, and you can ask me
that would be
where
lovely.
we come from there, and I can show it off to you.
Yeah, we'd love that. Thank you very much, Michaela. It was a great pleasure.
Of course. Thank you.
And with that, we'll wrap up this episode. Thank you very much for listening, and hear you next time.
That's it for this episode. This episode of the Resilience Podcast was brought to you by Pronovix. You can learn more about our company at pronovix.com, and thank you for listening.